Spanning from the 14th to 16th century CE, the Renaissance era in Italy saw a blossoming of fine art, classical education, and mercantile trade, but also an upsurge in cutthroat politics. Amongst the sun-kissed fields of Tuscany, one city embodies this flourishing of high culture. The city of Florence was one of the major hubs of Renaissance developments, a status it achieved due to its cadre of aristocratic families. In this, one family stood above the rest, the magnificent Medici. This clan of highbrow patrons and dastardly politicians dominated Florentine politics, with many of its members remembered to this day as industrious polymaths to villainous tyrants and everything in between. To understand the legacy of the Medici and just how they changed Florence, we must study the entire history of the family itself. Who were the Medici? What role did they play in Florentine and Italian politics? And how did they turn Florence into the greatest bouquet in Tuscany? Welcome to our video on the history of the Medici family. This video is a collaboration with Paradox to celebrate the upcoming release of Europa Universalis 5. The origins of the Medici family can be traced to the 13th century CE. Although natives of Tuscany, the Medici were likely not originally residents of its largest city. The first document mentioning their existence in 1230 pinpoints their location to Mugello, to the north of Florence. During this tumultuous epoch, the Italian peninsula was organized into multiple regional polities, such as the Papal States surrounding Rome, parts of the south run by Iberian monarchs, and the north's many oligarchic republics. Florence, or Firenze in Italian, was one such republic, and was run by various guilds of professional craftsmen and nobles. Amongst them, a council of 9 formed the governing council known as the Signoria, run by a justice official known as the Gonfaloniere, and an unofficial head of state known as the Gran Maestro. This guild-organized system of governance created distinct networks of political and economic elites, which enterprising politicians had to navigate through carefully in order to succeed. The 13th century was also an era when Florence became a powerful polity. This was due to both its profitable industries, such as cloth-making, and the rise of its banking system. These lucrative businesses funded mercenary armies and allowed ambitious Florentine nobles to expand their estates and embark on new industrial undertakings. Nevertheless, Florence's rise was consistently challenged by rival states, such as the other Italian republics and the Pope, who, during this era, controlled a temporal kingdom known as the Papal States, and sought to control politics wherever the Roman Catholic faith was present. Early in their history, the Medici likely went to Florence proper and began to amass wealth through work with the guilds. They began their rise to power in 1371 CE, when one of their members, Silvestro de' Medici, assumed the political office of Gonfaloniere. Silvestro used his political office in a determined manner, passing laws in favor of up-and-coming minor guilds that were excluded from political power by older nobles allied to the Pope. However, the most important early Medici member was the founder of their famous bank, a man known as Giovanni de' Bicci. Having received only a minor part of the family inheritance on account of having 4 other brothers, Giovanni went to work to increase his wealth. He generated income with a pair of wool workshops and his connections to more than one guild to gain capital, which he used to establish the Medici Bank in 1390 CE. Giovanni was also notable for keeping to a modest, unpretentious lifestyle in order to maintain the image of the man of the people. Thanks to Giovanni, the Medici now had a vastly expanded source of wealth, which they leveraged to purchase strategic intermarriages with other noble families to rise higher in Florentine politics. They also began to clash with the established great family of the city, the Albizzi. This rivalry intensified when Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Bicci, came to the political scene. Cosimo expanded the Medici Bank throughout Europe, establishing branches as far north as Munich, and also secured the bank as the favoured partner of Pope John XXIII. However, in 1433, anti-Medici politicians, backed by the Albizzi, managed to gain a majority in the Signoria and have him exiled to Venice. Cosimo only stayed there for a year, when a new election gained him new allies and allowed him to return. Giovanni spent his life managing alliances with surrounding cities, helping Byzantine scholars establish themselves in Italy and patronizing the arts, such as the famous statue of David by the sculptor Donatello. When he died in 1462, he was named Pater Patriae, or Father of the Fatherland. The next Medici patriarch, Piero, suffered from gout, and his impact on politics was relatively minor. However, Piero's son Lorenzo would come to be known as Il Magnifico and would become a maelstrom in Florentine politics. Lorenzo was born in 1449 and was given a humanist education by luminaries such as the Byzantine émigré John Argyropoulos. His mother, Lucrezia, was a poet who instilled in him a love of the classical and fine arts. His father instead focused the young man's interests on diplomacy. When Piero died in 1469, Lorenzo assumed the role of Medici Patriarch. He navigated through the challenges of this position with exceptional skill, oscillating between running for political office and managing affairs from behind the scenes. As was typical of Florentine politics, Lorenzo's success did not go unobstructed. Chief among his opponents were a family known as the Pazzi, as well as Pope Sixtus IV, who opposed the Medici due to their business ventures in Italy. These two parties eventually decided to work together against their common Medici enemy. Their schemes culminated on Sunday, April 26, 1478, when a team of assassins attacked Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano. The latter was killed, but Lorenzo survived with injuries, thanks to the intervention of some of his friends. Almost immediately after, Sixtus excommunicated Lorenzo and organized an invasion of Florence alongside Neapolitan troops. Lorenzo, a beloved leader due to his political reforms and sponsorship of the arts, was successful in rallying the people. Using mercenaries, a citizen army, and military skills, he succeeded in achieving a stalemate, but not in fully expelling the invaders. Thus, he went to Napoli, whose king, Florence, was allied to the Pope and was part of the invasion force. There, he managed to avoid assassination by using his connections to Ippolita Sforza, Florence's daughter-in-law, and by using his wealth to ingratiate himself amongst the Neapolitan people. He became a prisoner/negotiator for several months, until peace was finally achieved. Thereafter, Lorenzo devoted himself to maintaining a careful balance between the various powers of the peninsula. As for the Pazzis, they were captured and publicly executed, ending their rivalry with the Medici for good. Lorenzo's economic undertakings were more tumultuous than his political ones. Many of the Medici banks closed down due to a lack of funds, due to Lorenzo's mismanagement. Lorenzo himself ended up causing problems for the city by misappropriating public money. He died in 1462 CE with a mixed legacy, leaving the Medici to face a major challenger in the form of the cleric Girolamo Savonarola, a friar of the Dominican order. Girolamo was a wandering monk who preached social justice and denounced clerical corruption, but was also rather opposed to what he saw as the moral decay of Renaissance art, which emphasized nudity and humanism over the divinity of God. Lorenzo invited Savonarola to Florence in 1490 to help manage and strengthen the religious institutions there against the Pope. This move worked out in the Medici's favor until 1494, when Savonarola's religious fervor and populist message against the elites brought him into conflict with them. When the Medici came under threat by a French invasion from King Charles VIII, they conceded to the latter's demands for surrender in exchange for sparing the city. Savonarola exploited the people's fury over this decision, rallying the public and expelling the Medici from the city. Savonarola proceeded to run Florence for the next few years, in the manner of a religious Puritan. He even conducted a so-called Bonfire of the Vanities in 1497, burning many important works of art that were considered too crude because they displayed nudity and humanist ideals. Savonarola's conservatism was combined with an anti-pope sentiment, which meant that he also defied Pope Alexander VI's authority. This caused the pontifex to excommunicate him. Consequently, Savonarola began losing control of Florence. He was burned at the stake in 1498, alongside some of his friar accomplices. The Medici would remain in exile until 1512, when they managed to return to their beloved city and resume their presence in politics. Their rise to power had been rather difficult, but their golden age was yet to come, when they would rule not just Florence, but large swaths of Europe. The return of the Medici to Florence was relatively smooth, with different branches of the family assuming high political office in the early to mid-1500s. During this period, Pope Clement VII, who was himself a Medici, granted the title Duke of Florence to his relatives in Florence, thereby ending the Florentine Republic and re-establishing it as a duchy under hereditary Medici rule. Two men held the title of Duke of Florence, Alessandro de' Medici and Cosimo il Grande de' Medici, great-grandson of Lorenzo il Magnifico. Cosimo assumed the role of Duke after Alessandro's murder in 1537, and managed to defeat an alliance of anti-Medici exiles who planned to usurp him with the French. Cosimo ruled through his use of mercenaries until 1574, and his connections with outside political actors like the papacy, which elevated his rank to Grand Duke of all of Tuscany in 1569. The 16th century did not just see the Medici rule in Florence, but also elsewhere. For instance, Catherine de' Medici was both Queen Consort and Queen Mother of France from 1537 to 1564 CE. During this period, she managed diplomacy and conducted the affairs of state, including the massacres of French Protestants on St. Bartholomew's Day on the 23rd of August 1572. Another Medici woman to rule in France was Maria de' Medici, who was consort and regent from 1600 to 1617 CE. It was Maria who helped the famous statesman Cardinal Richelieu begin his rise to political prominence, after which he turned against her and exiled her to Spain. These two women are examples of the political shrewdness of the Medici, allowing them to survive and thrive even in foreign lands. The Medici also ventured into the religious sphere. As we have seen, the Florentine family had many enemies in the church, due to both their economic power and what was perceived in some ecclesiastical circles as too much of a love for contemporary art. However, members of the family, like Lorenzo, had placed some of their children into the church, with the hopes of them becoming major players in religious politics. This strategy emulated the famous Spanish family, known as the Borgias, from whom many popes rose to prominence, some of whom may or may not have engaged in fistfights with hooded assassins under the Vatican. The Medici succeeded in this, with the ascension of popes like Leo X and Clement VII, whom we mentioned above. Leo reigned from 1513 to 1512, and was a major supporter of the arts, to the point of bringing the Holy See to the verge of bankruptcy with his funding of artists. Pope Leo X is remembered in history as a politically active pope, who unsuccessfully tried to stop the early stirrings of the Protestant Reformation. He is also known as a sly Latin verse writer, a comedian, and an eccentric who liked to go on hunts and kept a pet elephant known as Hanno. The other Medici pope, Clement VII, reigned from 1523 to 1534. Clement is known as the pope who faced the sack of Rome by the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1527, where the Swiss Guard had its epic final stand against imperial forces. The sack was a result of Clement choosing to side with Francis I, King of France, in his power struggle in Italy against Charles, who ruled over both the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. The conquest of the Eternal City caused him to flee Rome, but he was later able to return. He also managed to negotiate important diplomatic alliances, like the marriage of Catherine de' Medici into the French royal family. Thus, whether abroad or in Rome, the Medici were always a capable and formidable bunch of political operators. Now that we've outlined an overview of the rise and golden age of the Medici, it is time to discuss their most lasting contribution to history, their patronage of the arts and letters. The Medici, like many European aristocratic families of the period, were fully immersed in the spirit of the Renaissance. This period of art and culture, which ranged from the 15th to 16th century CE, saw an increasing appreciation for the classical past that was meant to be emulated as the pinnacle of European culture. The Medici were also involved in both religious and secular art, being major sponsors and patrons of the arts that they saw as the manifestations of Renaissance and humanist values. Their magnanimity was seen all over the city of Florence, where large palazzos and churches, like the Medici Chapel, adorn the city's flowered streets. The Medici also sponsored an intellectual establishment, known as Platonic Academy, in Florence, as early as the time of Cosimo di Giovanni. There they conversed with important artists such as the legendary Leonardo da Vinci, the polymath extraordinaire and magnificent artist who embodied the spirit of the age through his work. Da Vinci spent multiple periods of his life in Florence under the patronage of the Medici, and it was there that artworks such as the Adoration of the Magi were produced. Da Vinci was also an ambassador of the Medici to Milan in 1482, staying there until 1499. Other Medici outside of Florence patronized their fair share of iconic Renaissance arts as well. These included the aforementioned Pope Clement VII, who sponsored the famous artist Raphael, commissioning him to paint the Transfiguration of Christ. Beyond art, the Medici also sponsored letters and classical studies. Thanks to the wealth of the city's guilds and the family's banking system, many luminaries of philosophy, theology and politics worked in Florence. Amongst them was the famous Catholic priest Marsilio Ficino, who lived in Florence during the time of Giovanni de' Medici and was a keen humanist and occult scholar. One of the foremost foundational works of Western esotericism, a text allegedly coming from ancient Egypt known as the Corpus Hermeticum, was partially translated by Ficino. Other colleagues of Ficino were focused on bringing Byzantine knowledge to Italy, such as the Greek émigré Demetrios Chalkondyles, who helped translate many Greek works into Latin. Other scholars include the notorious political theorist Niccolò Machiavelli, a foundational figure in realist and cynical views of public life. Machiavelli was involved in Florentine politics from 1498 until 1512 as part of the Chancery of the Republic, when the Medici were exiled from Florence. Upon their return, they accused him of being their enemy and then imprisoned and tortured him. He later became allied to figures like the ruler Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, to whom he dedicated his famous work known as The Prince. Machiavelli and Ficino are but two of the many intellectuals who made their lives in the Renaissance hub of Medici-run Florence, changing the course of Italian cultural history. The latter half of the 17th century brought about the sunset years of the Italian city-states as powerful players, and the gradual decline of the Medici family. This downward trend was not immediately visible. Between 1621 and 1670, the Medici Grand Duke of Tuscany, Ferdinando II, sponsored many artistic and scientific developments. Tuscany also participated in some important conflicts against the papacy in the 1640s. However, less competent leadership and an ever smaller economic base meant that Tuscany was growing weaker and weaker. By 1705, the state's coffers were almost bankrupt. The Grand Duke of the time, Cosimo III, was desperately trying to reach an economic settlement and even tried to restore the Republic after the death of his sole male heir. However, his plans never came to fruition after he died in 1723. Cosimo III was succeeded by his heir, Giangastone, who was a sickly and weak duke, who died in 1737. By this time, both the Spanish King Charles III and the Holy Roman Emperor Francis I hoped to assert control over Tuscany, with the latter succeeding. Gastone's heiress, Anna Maria Luisa, signed the family pact in 1737, which handed over the duchy to the Holy Roman Empire, on the condition that all its wealth stay within the region. Thereafter, the imperial House of Habsburg ruled over Tuscany until 1801, when they were deposed and a branch of the Bourbon family took over until 1807. After a short Napoleonic period, the Congress of Vienna restored the Habsburgs in 1815, and finally Tuscany was merged into the Kingdom of Italy in 1861. Parts of the Medici survive in various noble families all over Europe, and of course their artistic legacy remains a sight to behold. The 18th century, the Enlightenment, and Italian unification ended the regional polities that had defined Renaissance Italy. Many of these regional centres, like Florence, became parts of the broader, regionally rich network of the Italian nation. The piazzas and cathedrals of the city still adorn the landscape, and the myriad paintings and literary works that were produced during its Renaissance flowering are found in museums in the city as well as throughout the world. When we walk amongst these architectural wonders and gaze upon these paintings in those museums, we often find ourselves in awe. This feeling of splendor is a result of the eloquence and refinement that Renaissance Italians championed, with the Medici foremost among them. Whether in political backstabbing, educational pursuits, public works, or in religious conflict, the Medici were a powerful force that remade history in its image. They did this in conflict with other Florentine families, and even the papacy itself. It is this intersection of conflict and trade that made the Medici who they were, and made Florence what it is today. More videos on the Renaissance are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.